The old cafe smelled of freshly brewed coffee and a touch of cinnamon, the kind of place that promised warmth. The soft murmur of patrons speaking in hushed tones blended with the click of spoons against porcelain mugs. It should have been a comforting atmosphere, but for Derek, it only heightened the restlessness in his chest. The hum of normalcy seemed foreign to him, and he longed for the roar of his motorcycle or the quiet of an empty street. He shoved the door open with a little more force than necessary and scanned the room. His eyes immediately caught the corner booth where Sophie sat. The young girl, no older than 12, was quietly sipping from a cup, her head tilted toward the dog by her side. Thor, the German shepherd, was lying still on the floor next to her, his eyes alert but calm. Derek scoffed under his breath. "Another damn dog," he muttered, rolling his shoulders as he made his way to the counter. The barista smiled at him, a little too enthusiastically for his mood. "What can I get you, sir?" "A black coffee," he replied curtly, his voice rough as if he'd been swallowing glass. He tapped his fingers impatiently on the counter, glancing over at the girl and the dog again. There was something about their stillness that made him uneasy. Dogs like that weren't meant for normal people. They belonged with the military or law enforcement where they could do real work. As the barista prepared his drink, Derek's eyes followed the girl. She looked small in her wheelchair, but there was a quiet strength to her, something in the way she held herself, despite the obvious physical limitations. Thor, the dog at her side, seemed to be her guardian, his calm presence protecting her. "Don't know what you see in him," Derek muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was low, but Sophie heard it. She looked up at him, her brown eyes piercing through him like she could see every piece of guilt he carried. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone soft but direct. Derek felt an unexpected prickling sensation at the back of his neck, the kind that reminded him of Axel, the canine he had once trained with. That dog had never once shown weakness, but there were days when Derek had wished Axel could understand what he was going through, when he felt like the weight of his past was crushing him. Derek hesitated. He wasn't good at small talk, especially with a kid. "I've seen dogs like him before," he said dismissively. "They do the real work. Police, military. They're not pets." Sophie's gaze didn't falter, but Thor's ears twitched, and Derek felt the sharp awareness of the dog. His instincts screamed that this dog, unlike most, was no ordinary pet. "You think Thor's just a dog?" Sophie asked, her voice low, but there was a quiet fire in it. "He's more than that." Derek chuckled bitterly. "Right, sure. He's a damn hero in disguise." Sophie didn't smile. Instead, she gently patted the top of Thor's head, and the dog's response was instantaneous. Thor stood up, his posture straightening, his eyes fixed on Derek with an intensity that made Derek take a step back. "You don't know him," Sophie continued, her voice softer now, more contemplative. "Thor's been through more than you could ever understand." Derek's eyes narrowed. "And what, you think you're special, just because you've got a dog?" The words hung in the air, cutting the tension even thinner. Sophie looked down at Thor, and then back at Derek, her expression softening slightly. "He's not just a dog," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly now. "He's been with me through everything. He's my family." Derek stiffened, a sharp pain lancing through his chest. For a brief moment, he saw Axel's face in his mind. His old K9 partner who had saved his life countless times, only to be left behind in a moment of chaos. He quickly brushed it aside. "Sure," he muttered, turning away from them. "I'm not here to listen to a sob story." He grabbed his coffee when it was ready and walked toward the door, his mind racing with memories he'd spent years burying. But just as he was about to step out, he heard a low growl behind him. "Thor, no." Sophie's voice rang out, but it was too late. The dog had already moved forward, its body tensed and ready for action. Derek turned around, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "What, is he gonna bite me now?" Thor's growl deepened, a sharp warning. The dog's teeth were bared, but it didn't lunge. Instead, it stood its ground, staring Derek down. Okay, Derek muttered, holding up his hands. No need to get all worked up, Mutt. Sophie's voice, quiet yet strong, cut through the tension. Thor won't hurt you if you don't hurt him. Derek sneered. What, you think I'm scared of a dog? Sophie wheeled herself closer, her eyes steady on him. You should be scared of what happens when you treat someone or something like they don't matter. Derek's heart beat faster, the sharpness of her words gnawing at him. For the first time in years, he felt his walls cracking just a little. He turned his back on them, muttering under his breath. Whatever. I'm done here. As Derek stepped outside, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. His chest tightened, but he didn't dare acknowledge why. His motorcycle was parked just outside the cafe, its sleek black body inviting him to escape. But the image of Thor's eyes, steady and unwavering, lingered in his mind. He kicked the ground beneath his feet, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Derek couldn't get Sophie's words out of his head. You should be scared of what happens when you treat someone or something like they don't matter. The more he thought about it, the more they seemed to echo in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. He hadn't meant to start a confrontation with the girl or her dog. But there was something about Thor, something in the dog's eyes, that had stirred something inside him. Something he had buried for years. Axel. The pain. The guilt. Derek had spent so long running from it, trying to numb the memories with alcohol, bad choices, and the roar of his bike's engine. But Sophie's eyes, so full of pain and strength, had cracked through his walls, just as she had cracked through Thor's disciplined exterior. He spent the next few days avoiding the cafe, not because of Sophie or Thor, but because of the memories that still lingered from his military days. His time with Axel, the K9 that had been his partner in the field, in the trenches of foreign lands, when life and death were a mere breath apart. Axel had been more than a dog. He had been Derek's closest friend, a partner in ways that no human could match. But that was before everything changed. Derek sat alone in his apartment, staring at the empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. The memories wouldn't stop coming. He closed his eyes, and there it was. The flash of Axel's collar in the dust, the sound of gunfire, and then nothing. Just the sickening emptiness of losing someone who had trusted him with their life. He had failed Axel in the worst way possible. Axel had been injured during a mission. Derek hadn't been fast enough, hadn't protected him well enough. He had died in his arms. The knock on his door broke through his thoughts. Derek rubbed his face, his hand trembling slightly. He wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone. But when he opened the door, it was Sophie. She was standing there with Thor beside her, her wheelchair parked neatly on the sidewalk. She didn't say anything right away, just looked at him with those quiet eyes. Thor stood still, his usual calm demeanor now mixed with a slight tension. It was as if the dog could sense Derek's emotional turmoil. "Can we talk?" Sophie asked quietly. Derek hesitated, his instinct telling him to close the door and forget this whole damn thing. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the fact that Sophie seemed like the only person who might understand.
Fine. Derek grumbled, stepping aside.
But I'm not much of a talker. Sophie rolled inside, Thor following close behind. She looked around the room briefly, taking in the disarray. Empty bottles, a half-eaten meal left out. It was obvious Derek had been living in a fog. "You don't have to live like this, you know," Sophie said, her voice gentle, but there was strength in it. Derek's throat tightened. He turned away, trying to hide the crack in his facade. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you think," Sophie replied. "Thor, he's been through a lot too. He was trained by my father. He saved lives. But he's not just a dog to me. He's a reminder of something I lost. Just like you." Derek felt a flicker of recognition. "Your father." Sophie nodded, her eyes lowering slightly. "My dad was a police officer. He worked with Thor. They were partners, just like you and Axel." The words hit Derek like a physical blow. He spun around, his heart racing. "What are you talking about?" Sophie looked up at him, her expression soft but firm. "My dad, he was a K9 officer just like you. And Thor, he was trained alongside Axel. They were partners. I don't know the whole story, but Thor has been through everything with my family. And I know that pain you're carrying. I see it in your eyes. Just like I see it in Thor's eyes. Derek took a deep breath, his chest tightening. It was as if the walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling with every word Sophie spoke. The memories of Axel, his friend, his partner, the dog who had never judged him, who had always been there, rushed back in full force. I failed him, Derek whispered, his voice rough. I couldn't save Axel. He died because I wasn't fast enough. Sophie's face softened, and she wheeled closer to him. You're not the only one who's lost someone, she said, her voice gentle but filled with understanding. But that doesn't mean you can't make it right. Derek felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked at Sophie, her small form sitting before him, and the quiet strength she carried was overwhelming. He hadn't realized how much he needed someone who understood, someone who wasn't going to let him off the hook for his past. I don't know how to fix it, Derek said quietly. I don't even know where to start. Sophie smiled a little, her gaze flicking to Thor, who was now sitting calmly at her side. Start by not running away anymore. Start by being here, by helping. Maybe not just Thor, but yourself too. Derek met her gaze, his chest aching. The weight of his past seemed heavier than ever, but there was a strange sense of hope starting to build within him. The next few days passed in a blur, with Derek not entirely sure what he was doing or why. He started spending more time with Sophie and Thor, walking them through the park or just sitting beside them in quiet moments. It wasn't a magical fix, and it certainly didn't erase the guilt he carried, but it was a start, and that, for the first time in a long time, felt like something worth holding on to. Thor had become something of a symbol to Derek, not just of his failure, but of the possibility of redemption. Each time he saw the dog, he remembered Axel, his old partner, and the bond they had shared. Maybe he hadn't been able to save Axel, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to save himself. The weeks that followed were nothing like Derek had imagined. Every day, he woke up with a knot in his stomach, unsure of what he was doing or why he was doing it. But there was something undeniable about his growing bond with Sophie and Thor. It wasn't just about helping her. It was about helping himself. He was no longer running away. For the first time in years, Derek was allowing himself to feel, to confront the anger, the guilt, and the sense of hopelessness that had been his constant companions. But it wasn't easy. One afternoon, Derek was sitting at the edge of the park, smoking a cigarette and watching Sophie and Thor play fetch. She wasn't fast. Her wheelchair restricted her. But there was an unmistakable joy in her eyes as she tossed the ball for Thor. He couldn't help but smile at the way Thor bounded after it, his training obvious in every move. The dog was swift, precise, obedient. He was more than just a companion. He was a protector, and Derek couldn't help but see the parallels between the dog and Axel. You're a good dog, Thor, Derek murmured, his voice barely audible. Sophie caught him talking to the dog and smiled knowingly. He's not just a dog, you know? Derek chuckled, the familiar bitterness creeping into his voice. I think I'm starting to get that. Sophie rolled closer to him, her wheels humming softly on the pavement. She paused for a moment before speaking again, her tone lighter but filled with an understanding that Derek couldn't quite shake. You're not as tough as you pretend to be, she said softly, glancing at him. It's okay, you know, to let yourself feel something. Derek's smile faded slightly, the words landing like a weight on his chest. You don't know me, Sophie. You have no idea what I've done. Sophie's gaze softened. She shook her head slightly. Maybe I don't, but I know what it's like to carry pain. I know what it's like to lose someone you love and not know how to let go. She paused. My dad, he used to say that the hardest part wasn't the pain, it was the guilt. The feeling that you didn't do enough. That you could have saved them if you'd just done something different. Derek's heart skipped a beat. His thoughts flashed back to Axel, to that fateful moment when everything had gone wrong. The mission that had gone south. The explosion. Axel's final, trusting gaze. I could have saved him, Sophie? Derek whispered, the words heavy in the air. I didn't do enough. I froze. Sophie reached out and placed her hand on his arm. You're still carrying that guilt. But you're not alone in it. Thor was my dad's partner. My dad trained him to protect people, to keep them safe. He knew what Thor was capable of. And Thor, just like you, never gave up. Even when things went wrong. Even when it hurt. He kept going. The weight of her words hung in the air, and Derek felt a tear burn at the corner of his eye. But he refused to let it fall. Not yet. Over the next few days, Derek began to show up at Sophie's house more often. Sometimes it was to walk Thor, sometimes just to sit with her and Martha, her guardian. There was something oddly therapeutic about being with them. The emptiness he'd felt for so long began to lessen, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't had in years. One evening, after a particularly long day, Derek stood outside Sophie's house, staring up at the night sky. He heard the familiar sound of wheels on gravel and turned to see Sophie rolling toward him. "Hey!" she said, her voice calm as always. "You okay?" Derek didn't say anything for a moment. He was still sorting through the thoughts in his mind. Finally, he exhaled, his breath shaky. "I don't know. I'm trying to figure it out." Sophie tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. You've already done more than you think." Derek laughed quietly, a bitter sound. "I don't feel like I've done anything." She smiled gently. "Maybe you're just starting. But that's enough. For now, it's enough." A week later, Derek found himself sitting with Martha in the living room, having a conversation that he never thought he'd have. Sophie had gone to bed, and Thor was lying peacefully on the floor at their feet. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Martha looked over at him, her expression warm but filled with an understanding that Derek couldn't quite put into words. "I think you've been hiding from yourself for a long time, Derek," Martha said quietly, her voice gentle. "You've spent so much time running, so much time thinking you're not worthy of redemption. But you've already started to make things right. You're here. You're showing up for Sophie. For Thor. For yourself." Derek stared at the floor, a deep frown tugging at his face. "I don't know how to fix everything," he muttered. "I don't know if I ever will." Martha's gaze softened. "You don't have to fix everything. You just need to be present. You need to stop punishing yourself for things you couldn't control. Thor, Sophie, hell, even me. We're all here because we believe in you." Derek swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. "I don't deserve your belief," he whispered, barely able to speak the words. Martha smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Sometimes the people who need love the most are the hardest to give it to themselves. But we all make mistakes. It's not about erasing them, Derek. It's about learning how to move forward." Derek felt something shift inside of him. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in the dark. The following weekend, Derek took the first real step toward redemption. He found himself volunteering at a local K-9 rescue, helping train service dogs for veterans. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was something. It was a start. As he worked alongside the other trainers, he couldn't help but think of Axel and of the life he might have led if he had made different choices. But the more time he spent with the dogs, the more he realized something. Axel would have wanted him to keep going. He would have wanted Derek to keep fighting for those who needed him. One evening, as he walked Thor with Sophie through the park, she looked up at him, her face glowing with a quiet pride. "You're doing better, Derek," she said softly. "I can see it." He gave her a small, uncertain smile, but there was warmth in it, something real. "Thanks, kid," he said. "I'm trying." Sophie grinned. "You're not trying. You're doing." And for the first time in years, Derek believed her. Derek had never expected to find himself back in a situation like this. The adrenaline rush, the pounding of his heart, the deep need to focus on every single movement. It all came rushing back to him. But this time, he wasn't wearing his old military uniform, and there was no Axel by his side. This time, it was Thor. The police operation to locate Weaver, the missing veteran, was called in the dead of night. The veteran had gone off the grid, and his friends were desperate. They suspected that Weaver had fallen back into old habits, substance abuse and PTSD taking their toll on his life. The situation wasn't looking good, and the stakes were high. Derek had only half expected to get involved, but when he heard that Sophie and Thor were going to be part of the search, his instincts kicked in. He couldn't let them go into danger alone. Thor's special training was invaluable, and Sophie wasn't going to let him sit this one out, either. They met up with a group of officers, and as soon as Derek saw the team, the familiar tension set in. His body was wired, his senses heightened, like they had been during his time in the service. His mind flashed to moments with Axel in the past, working alongside him in those high-stress situations. But now he was no longer the man he had been. He wasn't sure if that made him stronger or weaker. Derek, one of the officers, Tom, called over to him. "Glad you could join us. You're sure about this?" Derek nodded, adjusting the vest over his jacket. He knew what he was doing, and he wasn't about to let anyone down, especially Sophie. "I'm in. Let's get this done." Sophie rolled up beside him, her face set in determination. Thor was walking by her side, his movements calm but alert. The dog's presence brought a sense of peace to Derek's troubled mind, but he knew things were about to get messy. "Are you sure about this, Sophie?" Derek asked, his voice low, a hint of concern creeping in. "This could get dangerous." Sophie met his eyes, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not letting Thor go alone. You know I can handle it." She spoke with such quiet confidence that Derek couldn't help but feel a spark of respect for the young girl who had been through so much. She was stronger than he'd given her credit for. "I know you are," he muttered, walking beside her. "But I'm not letting anything happen to you either." As the operation moved into the dense woods outside the city, the air felt thick with tension. Derek felt the weight of the mission bearing down on him, the feeling of uncertainty pulling at him. But he couldn't afford to let it show. Not now. Not when Sophie needed him. The night was eerily quiet, save for the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustling of the wind. Thor's ears perked up, his nose twitching as he began scanning the area. The dog was in his element, calm and controlled, despite the situation. Sophie stayed close, her wheelchair rolling steadily beside Derek. They reached a clearing, and Thor paused, his body rigid, his nose picking up something. Derek's heart rate spiked as he recognized the look in the dog's eyes. This was it. "We're close," Sophie said, her voice calm but sharp with focus. Thor's found something. The team spread out, positioning themselves around the clearing. Derek's nerves were taut, every muscle in his body ready to spring into action. He glanced at Sophie, who met his gaze with a quiet nod. The bond between them was undeniable, and for a moment, Derek felt like he was right back in the military, working alongside someone he trusted completely. But as they advanced deeper into the woods, everything went sideways. Without warning, gunshots rang out, shattering the quiet of the night. Derek barely had time to react before a loud explosion sent him diving to the ground, his body hitting the earth with a jarring force. Thor lunged forward, barking fiercely, while Sophie screamed as her wheelchair tipped over. "Stay down," Derek shouted, instinctively pulling Sophie into his arms, shielding her with his own body. He could feel the heat from the explosion and the sharp sting of debris hitting his skin. The chaos erupted all around them. "Thor!" Sophie cried out, her voice full of panic. Derek's heart raced as he looked up to see the dog charging at full speed, heading toward the source of the gunfire. Thor was taking point as he had been trained to do. Derek's mind flashed to Axel, to the way his K9 partner had always been the first into danger. The feeling was the same: protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But then something went horribly wrong. Thor leaped forward, only to be hit by a second round of gunfire. The bullet struck Thor's side, sending him tumbling to the ground with a pained yelp. Sophie's face turned pale with fear as she tried to reach out to him, but Derek was already on his feet, his instincts taking over.
No.
Derek shouted. He rushed toward Thor, shoving past debris and fallen officers. Blood stained the ground where the dog had fallen. Derek knelt beside Thor, his hands shaking as he gently checked the dog's wound. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice desperate. He could feel the dog's shallow breaths, could see the life slowly draining from him. Sophie was at his side in an instant, her face twisted in fear. Is he going to be okay?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to keep it together. "I don't know, Sophie, but I won't let him die," Derek said, his voice low but determined. "He's not going anywhere." The mission was a failure. The team had been ambushed and Weaver was still missing. The police were forced to retreat, and the remaining officers were wounded. But none of that mattered to Derek. Not when Thor was lying injured, blood pooling around him. They managed to get Thor back to the clinic, and Derek stayed by his side the entire time, refusing to leave, even as the veterinary team worked to save him. Sophie had been in shock. She had barely spoken since they arrived at the clinic, her eyes blank, her body still. Derek wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but he wasn't sure he could even convince himself of that. The thought of losing Thor, of letting Sophie lose the one thing she had left, made him feel like he was suffocating. Hours passed before the vet finally emerged from the operating room, his face grim. "He's stable," the vet said quietly, looking at Derek. "We've done what we can, but it's going to take time. He's a fighter." Derek let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. But as he turned to Sophie, he saw the relief flood her face. "He's going to make it," Derek said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thor's a fighter, just like you." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled faintly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving him." Derek didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he had truly saved Thor, or if it had just been luck. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely broken. The days that followed the operation were some of the hardest Derek had ever faced. Thor's recovery was slow, but the dog was a fighter, just as Derek had said. The bullet wound had been serious, but the veterinary team was hopeful. Sophie never left his side, and Derek made sure to be there too. He'd promised her that he wouldn't let Thor die, and he wasn't about to break that promise. But as the hours turned into days, Derek felt the weight of everything that had happened bearing down on him. The trauma, the guilt, the losses, it all started to resurface. But this time he wasn't running from it. He stayed. He helped. And slowly a shift began. It had been a week since Thor's surgery, and Derek was sitting in the clinic's waiting room, the sound of soft barking in the distance. Sophie was sitting beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her face etched with both hope and fear. She hadn't said much lately, and Derek could tell she was just as torn up inside as he was. But he knew she was strong, stronger than he had given her credit for. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Sophie finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Derek looked over at her, the weight of her question sinking into his bones. "Yeah, Thor's not the kind of dog who gives up. And neither are you." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to read the truth in his words. For a moment, Derek wished he could give her more certainty. He wished he could promise that everything would be fine. But the truth was he didn't know. He didn't have all the answers. What he did know was that he was here now, and that had to count for something. A few days later, Thor was finally released from the clinic. Sophie was there to pick him up, her face glowing with relief as she saw her dog standing, albeit a little unsteady, by her side. Derek was there too, feeling a sense of pride swelling inside him as he watched the dog move towards Sophie with such care, almost as if he knew exactly who he was. "Hey, buddy," Derek said softly, crouching down to pet Thor. The dog's tail wagged weakly but with undeniable affection, and Derek felt something inside him stir. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first real step toward healing, not just for Thor but for all of them. Sophie gently wheeled her chair up to Thor, her fingers brushing through his fur. "I knew you could do it, Thor," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're my hero." Derek stood up slowly, watching them together. There was a bond between them that was undeniable. Sophie had been through hell, but she was still standing strong, still fighting for the one thing she had left. Derek understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. You're a hero too, Sophie, Derek said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. You've been stronger than anyone I know. I'm proud of you. She looked up at him, her expression softening. Thank you, Derek, she said, her voice full of warmth. I think you're starting to understand. It's not just about what we've lost, but about what we still have. Over the next few months, Derek continued to help Sophie with Thor's recovery. He spent hours working with the dog, teaching him new commands, helping him regain his strength. It was hard work, but it was rewarding in ways Derek hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Sophie, too, began to open up more. She talked about her father more often, sharing stories about the man who had raised her, about the lessons he had taught her. Derek listened, each story breaking down more of the walls around his heart. He realized that Sophie wasn't just healing him. She was reminding him of the importance of hope, of forgiveness, and of the power of second chances. One afternoon, while they were walking through the park, Sophie turned to Derek. I've been thinking, she said. You're really good with the dogs. Maybe you could start training service dogs for other people. You have the skills, Derek. You could help a lot of people who need it. Derek stopped in his tracks, the weight of her words hitting him hard. For the first time, he realized that Sophie wasn't just seeing him for the man he had been. She saw him for who he was becoming. I don't know if I could do that, Derek admitted, his voice uncertain. I've never really thought about doing something like that. I don't think I'm the right person for it. Sophie smiled at him, a small but confident smile. I think you are. You've already done so much. You saved Thor. You've helped me. Maybe you just need to believe in yourself a little more. Her words resonated deep within him. Maybe he didn't have all the answers. Maybe he didn't have a clear path. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running from the past. He had to face it, deal with it, and move forward. A few weeks later, Derek found himself sitting in a meeting with a group of local veterans, many of whom had PTSD or other issues that made them struggle with daily life. They were there to discuss a new initiative to pair veterans with trained service dogs to help them manage their trauma. The project was in its early stages, but the foundation had already been laid. Derek was being asked to help with the training. He looked around the room, at the faces of men and women who had seen things he couldn't even imagine. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was out of place. He felt like he had a purpose, something bigger than himself, something that could help others the way he had helped Thor. Derek spoke up, his voice strong, more confident than he had ever been before. I'll do it, he said. I'll help train the dogs. I don't know everything, but I know enough. I'll give it my best shot. Sophie, sitting next to him, gave him a look of approval, her smile wide with pride. You're doing the right thing, Derek, she whispered. And for the first time in years, Derek believed her. Months passed, and Derek became a key part of the service dog training program. He worked tirelessly with both the dogs and the veterans, finding a sense of fulfillment he never thought possible. With Sophie's encouragement, Derek began to heal in ways he never imagined. One evening, as the sun set over the park, Sophie wheeled herself next to Derek. Thor was by her side, walking slowly but steadily. The air was cool, and the world seemed still. You've come a long way, Sophie said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. Derek looked down at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. Yeah, I think I finally found my way. Sophie smiled back, her eyes filled with gratitude. And you're not alone anymore. Derek glanced at Thor, who was walking by their side, steady and loyal. It wasn't just the dog that had been saved. It was him too. In this moment, he understood what Sophie had been telling him all along. Healing wasn't just about fixing the broken parts of himself. It was about learning to move forward, about finding a new purpose, and about embracing the connections that helped make him whole again. This story is about the journey of healing and redemption, showing how even the most broken individuals can find purpose again through empathy, support, and personal growth. It explores the emotional transformation of Derek, a troubled veteran, and his evolving relationship with Sophie, a young girl who has suffered her own trauma. Through their shared experiences with Thor, the service dog, the story highlights themes of forgiveness, responsibility, and the power of second chances. Ultimately, it underscores the message that healing comes from within, and sometimes it's through helping others that we help ourselves. The story conveys a powerful message of empathy, compassion, and resilience. It reminds us that our struggles don't define us, and with support, understanding, and a willingness to change, we can overcome even the most difficult challenges. The bond between humans and animals, especially service animals, is a testament to the deep healing power that can exist in unconditional love and mutual respect. By facing our pasts, acknowledging our pain, and moving forward, we can rebuild ourselves and make a positive impact on others. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like the video, leave a comment with your feelings, and share it with friends and family. Your interactions are a huge motivation for us to continue creating meaningful stories like this one. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on the next inspiring story. Every interaction helps us improve and produce even more powerful content for you. Thank you for being part of this journey. Once again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for watching and supporting. We hope you found this story meaningful, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Stay tuned, and take care.